Okay, well, our speaker today is David Wood. David is chair of London Futurists. He's co-founder of the Humanist Party UK. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and he has an honorary doctorate in science from Westminster University. And he's going to talk to us today about the abolition of ageing. So if you know how to give David an electronic clap with the reactions button, or just a thumbs up or whatever, I will hand over to David. So thank you very much, David, for coming to talk to us, and I will unmute you now. And David, I think you're going to share your screen with us.
Well, thanks so much for unmuting me. Nice to see such an interesting audience. As a futurist, I'll start with a simple prediction. There is a slight chance my internet connection will freeze at some stage in the next few minutes. If that happens, it should hopefully only be for a short while. And please chat amongst yourselves for 15 and 20 seconds or so until normal service is resumed here in Outer Surbiton, where I seem to be at the end of a long chain of cables. Let me indeed share my screen. Let's find the right screen here. Hopefully you can now see that I am virtually in Dorset Humanists, and my title for the talk is The Humanist Case for the Abolition of Ageing. As you heard, I chair London Futurists. I've done so for 12 years, and in that time we've had perhaps more than 240 meetings in which various people have given their predictions for what may or may not happen in the future. If something I say strikes you as interesting, you want to follow up afterwards, you can find me online easily enough. For example, on Twitter, my handle is @DW2, or you can find me on Google.
We seem to have lost David for a moment.
A point of view.
Oh, okay.
I froze a bit, did I? Just as I predicted.
Yeah, we froze for a moment, David, but I think you're okay now.
Right. So this handsome person is not me. This is Alan Kay, who in 1982, as well as saying that the best way to predict the future is to create it, he also said a point of view is worth 80 IQ points. Now we can argue whether it's meaningful to measure IQ in such a way, but it's certainly true that a fresh perspective can provide lots of new insight. And I'm hoping in the 40 or so minutes ahead to provide you with some different perspectives that will spend a bit of time talking about the acceleration of technological change. I'll spend a bit of time talking not about aging, which is a pretty complex and controversial subject in which people have nuanced views, but I'll talk a bit about illnesses and their causes. I'll talk a bit about learning from nature, because it turns out not every natural organism ages and what we can learn from that. And I'll talk about improving upon nature, transcending what we've inherited from nature. It's a core part of human nature, in my observation, to be willing to improve upon nature. Indeed, it's a core part of human nature to want often to improve upon human nature. But let's start with looking at accelerating technological change, and I'll introduce this by talking a bit about my own professional experience. About 25 years ago, I didn't have futurist on my business card. I had software architect. I worked in a UK-based company called Symbian. Some of you might remember the handheld computers that Symbian created. The one on the left was a model that sold about 1 million devices in the early 1990s. And in the middle 1990s, we were doing what all good companies do, which is to extend and improve upon an existing idea. So the device I'm showing now came out in 1999, better screen, better applications, better operating system. But there's more to improving business or improving technology than just doing more of the same. The most interesting things happen by disruptions, outside forces. So we realized that our world, which we were tracking, the world of computers getting smaller and more mobile, was about to be overtaken, impacted, converged, collided with another larger trend from the mobile phone industry, whose devices were becoming more smart. This isn't just about following your existing trends, it's about anticipating disruptions. We eventually decided to spin out a new company, Symbian, to address the possibilities of this new space. This picture you can see is from June 1998, when we persuaded Nokia, Ericsson, and Motorola, the three giants of the mobile phone industry in these long ago times, to fund us to the estimated value of £100 million. And we wanted to patiently build an ecosystem, tools, and the possibilities for new devices to emerge using the operating system from Cyan and applications from the mobile phone world. The reason I talk about this is I think it sets a pattern for what's going to happen in many other technologies in the years and decades ahead. What happened with Symbian is we had, I can tell it in sort of three phases. There was a phase of disappointment when nobody was that interested in what we were doing, then a phase of dramatic success, and then a phase of disappointing failure again. Let me briefly put that on a picture. There we are in the middle there in that orange phase one, smartphones. It took a while for our devices to be more interesting to the market than the dumb phones or feature phones, which were so popular before that. Devices which were just phones and had little software apart perhaps from a game called Snake or similar. We wanted to persuade the market that in due course more people would use these smartphones which had many applications built in, lots of software, mini computers in their own right. Eventually we were successful after lots of disappointments, and our partners such as Nokia and Motorola sold in due course between them hundreds of millions of smartphones running this operating system, and competitors such as BlackBerry, some of you will remember fondly, and Palm, that some of you will also remember fondly, did very well too for a while, until there was another big disruption, which started again slowly, but then took off in an accelerating form. And phones using Apple's software or Google's Android software at first did poorly and then did wonderfully well, being supercomputers with much more powerful software. So there's lots of lessons from this that I want to apply to the possibilities for improved biotech and improved AI in the future. I've summarized these in a book a while ago, and to summarize the summary, the most interesting changes do happen by disruption, which tend to have a slow, disappointing phase before things sometimes take off in a fast and furious phase. By the way, these disruptions aren't just about building new technology, they're not just about new therapies or new treatments, they're about building a whole ecosystem of supporters, of legal agreements, of trainees, of consultants, of good designers, services, and so forth. And by the way, just when you think you are mastering a disruption, you have to bear in mind that disruption happens in waves, and the next wave is often bigger than the previous wave, and each of the new waves tend to have new ideas, new tools, and new people. And the last of these four lessons is that outcomes are by no means inevitable. It depends very much on what humans want to do and what they actually do. And likewise, the possibilities for the abolition of aging will depend on decisions that we humans take individually and in groups. The future comes in waves. Arguably, the biggest sets of waves are the four waves of the Industrial Revolution. What's changed history much more than kings and queens, even than crusades and wars, from many points of view, what has changed history most of all has been technological progress via the Industrial Revolution, based upon groups applying the principles of science, groups being able to criticize establishment orthodoxies, being able to criticize authorities, being able to form businesses in alliances. So the world got changed by the development of more advanced steam engines, mechanization, and the due course trains. The world got changed again more dramatically, more scope, with the second industrial revolution that some historians talk about, in which electricity gradually displaced steam. Petrol-driven engines came along in due course too. Synthetic chemicals augmented what natural chemicals could do, and there was mass production. The world was changed for both good and for ill. A third wave involved computers starting to displace humans from the workplace. It involved consumer electronics, going back to the very first integrated circuit with silicon semiconductors in 1959 by Robert Noyce, who was
We seem to have a bit of a gap at the moment, so we'll just be patient, I think, as David asked us to be patient. Maybe we've lost David. Have we lost you completely? David, we lost you for a while then. Are you back? David Wood, we can't hear you at the moment, unfortunately. I don't know if you can hear us. We can see your screen. Ah, you seem to be muted.
right.
Yeah, you're back, David. We lost you for about a minute or so then.
I'm sorry, I think Saturday seems to be the worst day in my experience.
Yeah, okay. Do you want to just backtrack a little bit? Maybe, I think I got as far as the third industrial revolution. You were talking about electronics and stuff.
Right. Well, I wanted to point out that the third industrial revolution changed the world even more, with consumer electronics dating from 1959, the first integrated circuit based on silicon semiconductors. And now we are in something that people are calling a fourth industrial revolution, which I think is a fair description. But before I talk about that NBIC, I want to point out there is an acceleration in timescales going on here. Each new wave tends to be starting more quickly than the gap between the previous waves. And I see this as due to positive feedback cycles. What do I mean by NBIC? I mean 4 separated but overlapping waves of technology. I stands for infotech, which is understanding bits of data, not just computing with data, not just storing data, not just communicating data. That's all third industrial revolution, but making sense out of data. It's machine learning, processing big data. It's not just software, it's software written by software based upon data. N stands for nanotech, manipulating and understanding matter at ever smaller scale. It's computers that will in due course be as small as nanobots that could enter the bloodstream. It's 3D printing. It's nanosensors. B is when we understand and manipulate not just our silicon, but we can increasingly understand and manipulate our genes and other aspects of our biology, such as our biome, our epigenome, and so forth. And then C stands for cognotech. It's our understanding and improvement of the neurons that are in our brain. It's the fourth in terms of the least developed of these revolutions. Perhaps it's the most significant in due course. So I draw this as 4 quadrants because the top is hardware, the bottom is software, the left is physics, and the right is biology. But what's particularly interesting is the connections between improvements in one field and other fields. So as we have better nanotechnology, we can have sensors that can understand what's happening in people's brains without having to cut people's heads open. And as we understand what's going on inside people's heads when they're being creative or intuitive or meditating or solving hard general problems, we can copy some of that learning into our artificial intelligence. So it's no surprise that many of the leading AI companies have many of their PhDs hired with backgrounds in neuroscience. And then as these improvements take place, we are able to understand large sets of medical data and other biological data more fully and make progress there. So this fourth industrial revolution is still at early days. It will be propelled, as the other revolutions were, by feedback cycles. Machinery was built by tools, which then helped build better machinery, which built better tools, and so forth. Synthetic chemicals, part of the second industrial revolution, required chemical reagents, but the more reagents we synthesized, the more scope there was for building even more chemicals with all kinds of properties. Computers were initially difficult to build by hammer and nail, by hand, designed on paper and pencil, as it were, but we can use the skills of the disciplines of computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing to build new, improved generations of computers. And so on the feedback goes. Software is built by humans, of course, but humans taking advantage of software tools like debuggers, compilers, profilers, optimizers, and so forth. And so smaller software teams are able to build more complex software with, don't laugh, more quality. That's in the past. The next wave of improvement is AI, created in part by humans who are using AI tools to help them. The biggest overall feedback cycle is one that involves more and more people. And some people are afraid about more people on the earth, but you know, more people means more brains, especially when more people are highly educated, especially when they are networked together. People in all countries of the world have access to lots of fascinating information online, are able to bounce ideas off each other around the world. So it's no surprise we're seeing more tools and more technology. But the technology improves the networking. The technology improves the opportunities for online education, which is why we have more people acting with high knowledge of science and engineering than ever before, people who understand how to turn technological ideas into products, taking advantage of more people who understand design skills, more educators. That's why we have more AI, more deep learning. That's why, in my view, we're likely to see more change in the next 20 years in all fields than in any preceding 20 years. And yes, more disruption too. So what about disruption in the fields of aging? As I said, aging is a controversial topic, but let's start approaching it by asking about illness, because although some people are unsure whether they're against aging or not, most people are unhappy about illness. Few people on this call will put up their hands and say they're looking forward to dementia or heart disease or cancer. Throughout history, people have rightly wondered, why do some people fall foul of illness and die young or younger, and what can be done to stop it? And there's been 3 great phases of approach to dealing with illness. For a long time, the view was, if you behave badly, if you are too gluttonous or too lazy or too proud, if you're too angry and get into fights with the wrong people, if you're too lustful and have sex with the wrong people, you're likely to get ill and die. And there was a gist of truth in that. And on the whole, if people repented of such behavior and behaved better, it cut down some of the risks of some illnesses. But most people could realize
we've got another little gap. We'll just wait, hopefully.
into days that most people throughout history could not see and could not even imagine. So the second wave involved people understanding about hygiene, and many changes were put in place eventually. There were struggles to accept them, but the view was that doctors needed to express better hygiene, and we learned about antibiotics and about vaccinations to deal with many of the infectious diseases. And we haven't solved all infectious diseases yet, of course, as COVID reminds us, but we have learned a lot. But still, even with good hygiene, even with good behavior, there are still many people ill. And the third phase is just starting. It's the realization that many diseases are accelerated by what we would call bad biology brought on by aging. That our biology at the cellular level and between our cells gradually accumulates damage, sometimes called senescence, and that's what accelerates the likelihood of all of us catching chronic diseases. And the proposed cure in this new phase, taking advantage of the new technology that the fourth industrial revolution is gradually putting within our grasp, is to address the damage at the cellular and intercellular level. Something like this is surely the case, as we can see by looking at charts like this. We can see that as people get older, starting off teens or young 20s, moving through their lives, they become increasingly, all of us become increasingly more likely to die of chronic diseases such as heart disease, cancer, stroke, and so forth. There's an exponential increase there of the likelihood of us falling foul of these diseases and the likelihood of them killing us. This has actually been known for a long time. It's sometimes known as Gompertz law, after a member of the extended Rothschild family, Benjamin Gompertz, who produced tables of mortality of great interest to the insurance industry. He noticed that from early middle age onwards, we are twice as likely to die of all causes every 8 years. So is this just a hard fact of nature, or can we do something about it? And what I'm talking about is the possibility of doing something about it. There are, after all, variances. There are some people who don't fall foul of these diseases early in life. And these groups of people sometimes are in family clusters. Consider these two photographs. I wonder if you know what's going on there. It's the same set of 4 people. First with the eldest, Helen Reichert, 9 years old, and second when she is 99 years old. And her 3 siblings all lived quite healthily into their hundreds. They are examples of what researchers call super agers. They get to the age of 95 with no significant cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, or cognitive decline. They all died, of course, in due course. 2 of them died at 109, Helen Reichert, who spent some of her early hundreds on cruise ships, ballroom dancing, and Irving Kahn worked until the age of 108 3/4, at least 2 days a week, running his investment firm, taking the taxi from his home to his office. So what's interesting is that these groups of people do seem in some cases to form family clusters. If you want to live well until your 80s, you need to live healthily. If you want to live quite well until your early hundreds, you probably need some genetics on your side. Helen Reichert and one of her other siblings famously didn't like salads or vegetables. They smoked. I'm not here to tell you you should smoke or disdain your vegetables. I'm here to say, however, that we should be exploring what's genetically different about some of these people. It's also the case that these people who tend to live longer tend to cost the health service less. If you look at how much people cost the health service in the last year of their life, it actually goes down significantly. And if we look at the special subset of super agers who don't have these chronic diseases until late in life and who usually die of immune disease, some short-lived but deadly infection, the result is even more striking. So extended health span actually would, if we could duplicate what these super agers do, have major economic benefits, which is sometimes called the longevity dividend. So now I want to discuss 3 waves of so-called healthy aging. Healthy aging is something that has a great deal of interest these days, but most of it is understandably about helping people to age in place better. It says that people will age and will become frail, but let's give them the means to continue independent living. Let's give them sensors so that if they happen to fall over, their loved ones can be alerted. There are big initiatives in the UK. There's something called the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Aging, and it's nearly all focusing on this, and it's all important. A subset of that group is interested in learning from the people I've just described, the super agers, people who live like they're 75 despite being 95 years or older. And some of the healthy aging community is indeed looking at what these people do, learning from their diets and lifestyle, as well as seeing if we can learn from their genetics. But I'm talking about a third wave in which a smaller subset is looking at technology that will deal with aging more comprehensively, enabling people to be potentially forever young. They could be 125 years or older. Nobody has reliably lived to such an age yet, according to the best records, but it is the view of this thought that people could in due course live as if they were still 35 in terms of vigor and resistance to diseases. I think this is possible with about probability 50% by the year 2060. I also think that if society decided this should be a priority and shifted more resources onto doing it, it's probable with about 50% by the year 2040. As I said earlier, the outcomes of disruptions aren't determined by the technology, they're determined by human response. What do people tend to think about this possibility? In my experience talking to lots of groups of people about this, I imagine that most of you are in 2 minds. You are in part of your mind saying, this would be quite nice. Yeah, I'd quite like to live a bit longer. And you can see that it would be probably good, at least in the short term, for the economy if people didn't incur large healthcare costs as they lived in the later years of their lives. It would be good for the economy if people could keep on contributing as volunteers or in some cases as workers and could keep on traveling and using the economy. At the same time, you're probably thinking, this is a bit dangerous. It's an unrealistic fantasy. It's probably not going to happen. It's misleading to focus on this because there are shorter term, easier things that could be done, like fighting harder against COVID or against malaria or such like. And you probably also wonder, you've got some uneasy feelings. You're thinking that it might be good for the planet and for individuals in the short term, but in the longer term, it would be disastrous for overpopulation, climate change, growing inequality, and so forth. And in the remainder of my slides, I want to make the case against both of these red phrases. I want to argue that this is quite a realistic possibility, so we'd better think about it more. And I want to argue that it wouldn't be bad for the planet. It would actually be very good for humanity. And we'll start by looking at nature. Some of you may be familiar with these creatures. They are naked mole rats, so-called. They live in burrows, in colonies underground. And I'm going to say that they don't age. And I'll explain what I mean by they don't age. They do die, sometimes from infections, sometimes by fighting. they live much longer than nearly every rodent. In fact, they have the world record life for rodents. They don't get most of the diseases of aging that other species tend to get. Human lab researchers are very skilled at giving lab animals cancer, but the normal techniques don't work with these creatures. They shrug them off. Likewise, lab researchers know how to give most animals osteoarthritis, nasty researchers that they are, but again, these creatures seem not to be phased. So what's different about them? And can we learn from them? I'm going to argue that we can indeed be learning from animal super-agers even more than we can learn from human super-agers. And I'll dip into the science just a little bit as a way of showing you that there's some very interesting and good science going on here. It turns out people found that these creatures have high molecular weight hyaluronic acid. You've probably never heard of hyaluronic acid, although if you study cosmetics, you may know about it. It's something that all of us have. It's not in our cells, it's in the scaffolding between our cells. And it turns out that these creatures have got longer chains of it than most other animals, and they have higher weights. Could this be a cause of their resistance to cancer and their unusual long lives? Well, scientists do what scientists do. They look around. Are there other creatures that have similarly long chain hyaluronic acid? And it turns out that some dogs do. I'm not sure what you think of this creature, whether you like it or you think it's grotesque. It's called a Shar-Pei dog. And for centuries, at least some people in China thought it looked cute. And dog trainer breeders in China for centuries bred them for even more skin folds. And without realizing it, they actually were accumulating long chain hyaluronic acid in their connective tissue. So, do these dogs live longer than most? How could we tell? It turns out some researchers tracked down a database of 105,000 samples of tissues taken by dogs at 3 private clinics in Switzerland over more than 50 years. And in this large sample, there were enough Shar-Pei dogs to have a significant result. And yes, they do have less cancer tumors, 4 to 6 times less than other dogs of similar age and weight. Interesting. What's the next thing to do? Well, researchers said, can we do genetic editing? Can we take these naked mole rats and in their embryo stage, knock out the gene? There's actually more than one gene, it's complicated, but knock out at least one of the gene that gives them this long hyaluronic acid. What do you get? A transgenic naked mole rat that, it turns out, the results are from Vera Gorbunova. There's a conference every year called Undoing Aging. If you're interested, you can track down these online resources. It's going to be held in Berlin again this year, COVID pending in, I think, October or November. Anyway, her results show that you get creatures, well, you don't get mice, but you get creatures that are much more likely to get cancer, just like mice. What's the next thing you do? Some of you might be thinking ahead to the next phase of this scientific experiment. You take a normal mouse, you genetically edit it to add in this long chain hyaluronic acid. You get a transgenic mouse, and they are at early middle age, 2 years old. They are fitter than their untreated contemporaries. They ran twice as far on their treadmills. They have a stronger grip. That's another assessment of health. They have smoother skin and fur. So if you're interested in smoother skin or fur, this might be of interest to you. And yes, they get less cancer. In terms of their longer lives, that result has not yet been published, but there is some increase in lifespan there too. Google are interested in naked mole rats, or when I say Google, I mean an offshoot of Google called Calico Life Sciences, which was set up to investigate how to deal with aging. And here's the results that they published recently. It shows the likelihood of different species to die throughout their lives as they get older. If you see graph C, that shows the human curve of increasing mortality as we get older. Mice have the same general curve, horses have the same general curves, naked mole rats don't get any more likely to die the longer they live. In this sense, they don't age. You can see them as unusual in that combined graph, and the publication from Calico was naked mole rat mortality rates defy that Gompertz law, which I mentioned earlier. So there's lots of research into what we might learn from these naked mole rats. If that was the end of the story, it wouldn't be that interesting, but there are several other species who in various ways also seem not to age. We've talked about the naked mole rat. We could learn from the lobsters, which just get bigger and bigger. The rough-eye rockfish has been dated to living 205 years. How on earth do you know? It's a bit controversial, but they have eyes which have eye rings, a bit like trees have tree rings. And then there's these bowhead whales. Icelandic whalers often reported that when they were young, their grandfathers would point out particular whales in the distance with distinctive markings and say that when they had been young, their grandfathers had pointed out the same whales, with a suggestion that these whales might be very long-lived. Is this just an old tale? Well, it turned out to be verified to an extent a few years ago when a whale was harpooned, and when it was examined, it was found to have inside it the remnants of a type of harpoon that hadn't been used for 120 years. So this whale had survived the previous encounter and lived another 120 years. These creatures are enormous. You might imagine that the larger a creature is, the more likely it is to get cancer. There's no evidence that such creatures have cancer. We could talk about clamshells, which in some cases have lived to 507 years. Being a clam is a bit of a boring life, but it shows there's no inevitability in nature for creatures to die. This was dated by a number of means, counting its rings and then doing carbon dating, nicknamed Ming because it started its life in the Ming dynasty. It probably would have been still splendidly alive if it hadn't been dredged up as part of an experiment to measure records of the temperatures in oceans. And we could talk about trees. Some trees also show no characteristics of aging. There's one that's been cross-dated at 5,000 years old. This isn't it. Its location has been kept secret to stop people going and interfering with it. But I'm told if you see it, you would say 5,000 years old? You don't look a day over 500. There's no indication of greater age with these trees. And some birds don't seem to age. This is an albatross, which has recently laid an egg. It has been tracked throughout its life by having tags put on it. It lives in Midway Atoll. I wonder if you can guess how old this new mother is. She is believed to be 68 years old. Most albatrosses just give one egg every 2 years. This one seems to be an exception and seems to give an egg most years and is believed to have laid between 30 and 35 eggs in her lifetime. There's her latest mate who is looking after a new baby that's been born. So for all these reasons, I'm inclined to agree with what Richard Feynman, the eminent physicist, said as long ago as 1964 in a lecture in Italy. There is nothing in biology yet found that indicates the inevitability of death. This suggests to me it's not inevitable, and it's only a matter of time before the biologists discover what it is that is causing us the trouble, and that terrible universal disease or temporariness of the human body will be cured. He said that round about the same time as he predicted quantum computing and round about the same time as he predicted nanotechnology in his famous article, There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom. You would be quite bold to bet against Richard Feynman there, especially considering the evidence I have shown you from nature. So to summarize so far, most of medicine today is governed by what I call Model 1. It is that most of these diseases are relatively independent. They have their own trajectory. They need their own investigation, their own treatment. And as for aging, That's hard. It's probably not even a disease, and it doesn't deserve much research dollars because it's even harder to deal with. But what's happening in at least part of the biogerontological world is akin to a Copernican revolution. A Copernican revolution, aging is pushed from being on the periphery to being at the center of analysis. And this is not a model of independence, it's a model of causation. As I pointed out earlier, the older people are, the more likely they are to fall foul of lots of chronic disease. And what makes this more than just a neat form of wording is that we can now, with some confidence, look inside that bubble. As, for example, Felipe Sierra did in a breakthrough presentation in 2014, aging, he says, is due to damage to fundamental biological processes, such as our stem cells no longer regenerating, the inflammation reaction, which is good when it's acute, turning sour and increasingly being chronic, our cells' ability to adapt to stress going wrong, our network of proteins stopping working, our metabolism generating too much junk products, causing damage to large molecules, causing our proteins to misfold, causing our epigenetics and our regulatory DNA to go wrong. And we can argue about what's in the bubble, but what's really interesting is that there are lots of ideas on how to deal with each of these inner causes. So if we put more research into there, we will perhaps find better ways to stop the impact of all these illnesses. Different researchers break down inside the bubble in different ways. Here are five prominent European researchers, including some from Spain, like Mario Blasco, some from Germany and the UK. They break it down into 9 hallmarks of aging. And it's an open question as to which are fundamental and which are side effects. This is probably the most cited article in this field. The underlying theory is worth spending a bit of time thinking about. It is that as we live, we have a complex metabolism of biochemical reactions that animate us, make us do all the things that we do, which have some side effects of damage to various pathways. And when we are young, we have lots of repair mechanisms that deal with the damage. And so we remain fit and healthy. But over time, the repair mechanisms get damaged too. So you can see that over time, there's a positive feedback cycle. More damage to the repair mechanisms leads to more damage overall, exponentially growing. That's the basis for the Gompertz curve I showed you earlier. And what does the damage do? It makes us more prone to all sorts of diseases, heart disease, cancer, dementia, stroke, weaknesses in our immune system, which are the reason it is believed why elderly people are much more at risk of COVID-19, and so on. And when we are young, we can resist and suppress diseases quite often, but eventually the damage gets too much and we die. And healthy aging typically says, well, let's help people to age with dignity. Let's help them to cope with diseases as they are old, but it's hard because the more damage we accumulate, we tend to have multiple comorbidities. Some researchers say, let's go back to the beginning of this process. Let's edit the biological metabolism inside humans to have less damage created. And that's quite promising, but I think, as do most people in this field, it's very difficult because most of the changes have side effects which are hard to manage. The best approach is to do better what the human body already does, which is to remove damage periodically by a number of engineering interventions. A bit like we go to the dentist or the hygienist periodically and get early damage treated before it causes us more problems. So the idea is that this approach, whilst hard, is less hard because there are a limited number of categories of damage. And this is best summarized in the work of this gerontologist, Aubrey de Grey. He's quite often on in the media. You may have seen him. I've known him for about 20 years, And he has for 20 years been saying aging is caused by 7 types of damage. His approach is called SENS, which stands for Strategies for Engineering Negligible Senescence, so that we can be more like these creatures I've referred to earlier that don't have a build-up of senescence as we age. And it's engineering and it's strategies. And you can find out more about this from sens.org. It's a nice, easy URL to remember. What's interesting is not just the classification of damage, but it's the strategies to deal with the damage. When I met Aubrey first, it was talk, 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 and he was asking for funding. But in the last 10 years, there's been more and more interesting work here. Stem cells are now very much a huge area of research. More recently, senolytics is a phrase you may have heard. It's a way of dealing with cells which ought normally to be recycled as they have gone wrong. The body's natural repair mechanisms, however, stop working, and we end up with an accumulation of senescent cells, sometimes called zombie cells. But there are more and more companies looking at senolytics to deal with this, including one that has been the recipient of funding by the world's richest man, Jeff Bezos from Amazon. So this is all written up in a very interesting but quite technical book, Ending Aging, which you might want to look at, although in a minute or two, I'll give you some other reading. The basic idea is we can learn from nature how nature deals with accumulating damage. We can copy some mechanisms from nature. We can improve some mechanisms from nature. And we might even go beyond nature's capabilities with some things like nanobots and other interventions. So what could we learn from nature? There's lots of fascinating examples. Here's an amphibian that has a feature that probably would be useful for humans. If it is damaged, it often can regrow. Its limbs, its tail, even its eye, its jaws, part of its spinal cord, part of its heart, even part of its brain. How does it do it? It's still a bit of a puzzle, and people are studying it hard to figure out could similar mechanisms be used to help repair broken human spinal cords, for example. So we can learn from nature. We can also improve upon nature. What's going on here? This is research from Spain, from Maria Blasco, the researcher I mentioned earlier, one of Spain's leading anti-cancer researchers, who is very much interested in approaching cancer by approaching aging. What's going on here is that as we age, the cells in our bodies lose their ability to divide, because every time our cells divide, the chromosomes get copied, but a bit at the end of the chromosomes called telomeres doesn't get completely copied. So every time it gets copied, the telomeres get shorter, and eventually the cells can no longer divide. But there is an enzyme that can extend the telomeres again. And if you take early middle-aged mice, age 1 year old, and you inject gene therapy to change their chromosomes throughout their bodies, it extends their median lifespan by 24%. If you take early old-aged mice, 2 years old, the same treatments doesn't have quite such a dramatic effect, but it still means they live 13% longer on average. And what the cancer researcher was most interested in is, well, does the longer telomeres have the wrong side effect of boosting cancer? No. These creatures are as healthy as their untreated contemporaries. Other research that is just an example of what people might look at. There's something called parabiosis, when a young and old mice are paired together in an experiment that allows the blood to circulate between the two of them, sort of like creating Siamese twins. The mice don't like it very much, but in some circumstances they get to tolerate each other. This is called parabiosis. And when afterwards you look at the organs of the old mouse, look at their muscles, the liver, the pancreas, the heart, even the brain, they are characteristic of mice that are much chronologically younger. Unfortunately for the mouse, young mouse, the other goes the wrong way around. So their organs tend to age. So this isn't, of course, being advocated seriously as a treatment in its own right, but it's been advocated as something to study. So Tony Viscaray, a researcher in London, has in his TED Talk from 2015 said this could be the most promising line of inquiry to treat human neurodegeneration. That's 5 years ago. If we fast forward to May 2020, recent research, very recent research, in which there are 3 bars in each of these charts. The left bar is old rats, 109 years old. The right bars are, the middle bars are controls who are just 30 weeks old. And the rightmost bars are old rats who were treated with injections of plasma taken from young mice. So the young mice are still alive, but plasma of various sort was taken from them, and some ingredients were injected on a daily basis for about 2 weeks, and then afterwards the rats were studied. And you can see a wide number of indications of their effective age were reduced on average by 54%. Their blood was characteristically younger, their liver was characteristically younger, their heart was characteristically younger. Hypothalamus wasn't as young, but still statistically significant, and their memories improved too. These old mice that had been treated in such a way had better memory of solving mazes and doing the mazes again once they were returned to them. All right, so let me close by looking ahead, anticipating the growth of this ecosystem, anticipating positive feedback cycles, which will change this field from having just very few people in it, outsiders, dissidents, who dared to imagine it was worth looking at aging, people like Michael Rose, who did his postgraduate research, his PhD rather, in Sussex with John Maynard Smith. He did experiments in which he selected fruit flies for multiple generations, each generation picking the fruit flies that laid eggs later in their lives, and doing this over many generations, over a decade. The fruit flies on average tend to live 4 times as long without showing any deterioration of their health in almost every regard. Cynthia Kenyon, a young researcher, showed that by a single genetic change in a worm, the worm would live twice as long. Over time, more people said, you know what, this is a strange field, but it's worth doing some research in it because you can get some results. So the field has grown. In my observation, roughly tenfold every decade. I think by the time the 2020s are over, there might be around about 100,000 people doing interesting, serious work in this field, and possibly 1 million people by the end of the 2030s. And I think the problem in this field, although hard and difficult, can be solved by 1 million people if we can get people collaborating in a constructive way. Where are these people coming from? They're coming from very large industries. The cosmetics industry is very interested, not just in things that make people look younger or feel younger, but in a sense, revitalize them. Military, sports, food, pharma, and IT is interested. I already mentioned the Calico group in the Google group of companies, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook in various ways. Senior managers there have invested in approaching this. I also foresee a growth in citizen scientists, and it is more people are now ready to invest in this field. Rather than treating this as a lost cause, more people, as exemplified by multi-millionaire investment fund owner Jim Mellon. He's an interesting character, Jim Mellon. Turns out he's one of the bad boys of Brexit, but his views on anti-aging, I think, are spot on correct. He says that it is now the time for more people to invest, not in single startups, because most of the startups will probably fail, but in baskets of startups. And with a spread of investment, it is quite likely that at least some of these companies will be successful. So I think it's possible that by the 2040s, we will see affordable, comprehensive, reliable therapies in wide use, 120-year-olds being quite athletic. People might say 120 is the new 80, and eventually, not immediately, but in due course, 120 is the new 30. Probability 50%, but only providing society decides to do it. And many people say, this is hard, this is complicated, this is a stretch. Why don't you guys just learn to accept aging? After all, most of the great religious traditions highlight and praise acceptance. Buddhism's all about coming to terms with death, accepting it. The Stoics, also with Marcus Aurelius and others, highlighted acceptance. There's even inside Christianity a famous prayer, which I think is actually a good prayer, even for humanists, which is associated with the name of Reinhold Niebuhr. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. I think that's great advice. But it's not the end of the story. The prayer goes on with good advice for humanists too. God grant us courage to change the things we can change and the wisdom to know the difference. We shouldn't hold off from things that in the past were difficult to change, but which now are within our grasp. The difference varies over time. Science is enabling us to intervene more and more. And we can remember the Good Samaritan parable, in which Jesus in the New Testament scolded religious people who rushed by, preoccupied by their own religious disciplines, and failed to lend a helping hand when a helping hand could have been given to somebody, a Samaritan, somebody who had fallen ill. So rather than accepting nature, I think we have to know that nature is cruel. Nature, as in this saying from David Frum, the senior editor of The Atlantic, says, nature left to its own course once. For women, 5 of your 7 children dead, it wants you dead at 50. Anything better than that has been brought by science and technology, and let me add, good politics. People accepted things in the past that seemed at the time inevitable. Most old scriptures have no injunction to get rid of slaves. There is no commandment in the Old Testament to say, thou shalt not keep slaves. It was taken for granted that slavery was a part of society. The reference to slaves in the 10 Commandments is, don't envy your neighbor's slave. Just after the bit that says, don't envy your neighbor's wife, before the bit that says, don't envy your neighbor's ox or ass. The Bible does have rules asking for some kindness towards slaves. If you beat your male and female slave, and the slave dies, you should be punished. That's too much. But if they recover, that's fine, because the slave's your property. For most of history, people said slavery is probably not very nice, but what can we do about it? Until in some countries in the world, including in Britain, there was a growing movement of people that said, we no longer need to accept this. We should not accept it. And I believe the same is true of aging. So we can take some questions in a minute. I'll just share with you a couple of pages of possible further reading. If you're interested in the genetics, in the various philosophies involved, these are 5 relatively recent books that in different ways I think are accessible and have lots of good science, highlighting the difficulties to be solved as well as solutions. The first one's by a Harvard professor. Others are by a range of different people. The 4th one is by a female, a Romanian researcher, highlighting the difference in aging between different species. The last is by me, and I've also subsequently written more about the political environment that's needed for us to take full effect of the possibilities of aging. There's more that I could say, but I think I've gone on long enough for now. So I'm going to thank you for your interest and hand back to David for questions and answers.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very much, David. A beautifully crafted talk, wonderfully delivered, and you've come in exactly on time, so that's great. It's given us plenty of time for questions as well. I'm sure everyone has enjoyed that. Okay, now let me just, I think what I need to do is just change my view and probably unfocus so that we can, let's just see if I can get back to you.
People can also do the gallery view. to see
Yes, yeah,
everybody.
yeah,
But you can control it as well, I think.
yeah. Okay, right. Well, if people would like to ask a question or make a comment, if you can go to participants at the bottom of the screen. If you've got that on your screen, you click the button to raise hand. That's the easiest way for me to get to you. If you do raise your hand in the old-fashioned way, I will try to see you and get to you if I can. If you do put a question in the chat, I'll try to see those, but I might miss them. So the blue hand is probably the best way. Okay, so David Nunn was first up. So David, I'm just going to try and unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. Yeah, David, I think you're on. So what's your question?
Thank you, David. Very interesting talk. And I have no doubt that science will crack this, and you know, with enough time and investigation. But I just can't. I have to be honest. Cynically, I can't see the point. And we've already got an overpopulated planet. This is a first world issue where people in the third world are dying far too young. And I mean, there's a natural rhythm to the fact that people don't live forever. That they have a limited life. And I'll be honest, I can't really see the point in being healthy and fit and everything until you're 120. There's not enough jobs to sustain that, not enough food. I just see that it causes problems. So I don't really see the point of it.
So, excellent questions. Actually, the main cause of death, even in the third world, is aging as well now. If you look at what most people die from there, it's diseases that are increased significantly by aging. It's not the only cause, of course. In terms of overpopulation, I would like just to very briefly share my screen again, because the very next slide addresses the point that people are worried if there is more population size, and especially when more people live like the average American or average European, it's a very bad impact on the environment. So it's natural for people to be worried about this, since the technology that I'm talking about is likely to increase both these factors. But there's more to it than that. The impact on the environment is also influenced by the carbon intensity of the energy, and technology is allowing us to decrease that. And it's also, there's a dividing sign in here. The better we are at recycling, the less environmental impact there is too. There's a recent book by an MIT economist called Andrew McAfee, called More from Less, and he's pointing out many metrics in which actually we are having less of an environmental impact in the planet and still doing more to feed people. He's quite candid that there are some big problems left. He is not at all blasé about climate change, but I agree with him in general that technology can fix both of these parts of the equation. And it's the same technologies that will help us defeat aging. Synthetic biology will allow us to grow meat in labs much more efficiently than currently is the case. It will be tastier and healthier than meat that's grown in agriculture. It uses less water. It has less antibiotics. Other improvements in technology will gradually allow us to switch to solar or wind, perhaps even fusion. Other improvements can bring down the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere with negative emissions, nanotech in due course, and eventually space. We don't need to go there in a hurry. There's plenty of space on the Earth for more people. What's the point of it? I mean, that's another good question that you asked. If I can skip on to what's the point of it all, I'll come back to some of this in a minute.
David, now it looks as though your question was very much anticipated. So
yeah, I meant to go through this, but I got the. I mean, these are questions that are very much in people's minds, and they're good questions. When people say, "What's the point?" You know, what would you want to keep on living? Well, I'm not saying anybody needs to live if they don't want to live, but I don't know about you. I've got things I want to do for at least another 10 years. There's more music I want to explore. There's more literature I want to explore. I want to see my family grow up. I would like to see, in due course, grandchildren. I would like to explore mathematics. I would think there's much more point. People used to say, if there's no God, there's no purpose to life. People will behave in a very terrible way. Well, we humanists know that wasn't true at all, that people were perfectly capable of finding purpose in life, good purpose in life, meaningful purpose in life without God. Can we make our own purpose? Absolutely. And if there's no death, I think there's still possibilities for people to have lots of vibrancy in what they do. So I look forward in due course to exploring the moons of Jupiter. I look forward to exploring music beyond my current comprehension. I look forward to exploring lots of literature. In due course, I might get bored. I might want to switch myself off, but that should be people's voluntary choice rather than being forced into a decline. There's no need for us to be forced into decline as nature is doing currently. So I don't think I answered all of your points there, David, but I'll hand the microphone back to somebody else now.
Well, thank you very much for that pre-prepared answer. I'll leave it there. I think you've answered it perfectly well.
Okay, David, thank you very much. Okay, we've got Aaron next. So Aaron, I'll try and unmute you. Yeah, go ahead, Aaron.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely fantastic. And coming in with all those insights at the end, you knew it was coming, which is just brilliant. Well, I was going to ask you a question about cell degradation, but you ended up covering that. And on David Nunn's point, I think if we're going to get to 100, I want to get to 100 in fully operational form, not have the last 20 years being a bit suspect. So I think that's the biggest bonus. If we go beyond 100, that's a bonus as well. My biggest question is going to be a bit controversial because it's about the BAME category, who seem to be struggling with viruses and coronavirus at the moment. If we start making corrections, are we going to have a superior being, which could end up being white people, and other people that need to be edited in order to be up to scratch? How is that deemed in the science world?
So we of course need to understand why various people are more prone to diseases than others. Some people say it might be to do with vitamin D processing, that people who have darker skin aren't quite so good at synthesizing vitamin D, and this might be one of the causes. It's too early to say, frankly. We need to explore with a very open mind. It may well be that it's the social impacts that haven't been fully understood yet that is the main cause of this. But the general question you're asking is about inequality. Is there a scenario in which this will be quite expensive, this treatment, and that only a subset will benefit from it? And I think this is the main objection against this program. It's the main way in which it might go wrong. It is possible that although it's logical for everybody to benefit, if this can be spread around, it will boost everybody's health. It will have less costs generally, but it is possible that some people may not care. And so I think we need to counter that with not technology, but with better politics. You know, we have to take hold of the tendency of technology to exacerbate inequality. The same author I mentioned earlier, Andrew McAfee, has also written about the tendency of technology to boost the winner-takes-all effect, in which a small number of companies are extremely successful indeed, and the lion's share of revenues go to them. And if you're in second or third place, nobody's interested anymore when they can get the best solution easily. So we need to intervene with politics to redistribute. And that's not a very popular word in some phrases, in some parts of the world, but I think we need to assert that. And we need to therefore be sure that the research is done. It's a bit like, I'll come back to COVID one more time, it's a bit like, why don't we have vaccines for any coronavirus, let alone COVID? When the earlier coronaviruses such as SARS and MERS, people dabbled with vaccines, but were never developed, in part because there's not a good business case for large pharmaceutical companies doing that research. It's very expensive to develop it, and if they're successful, they don't make much money out of it because it only needs to be applied once. And although they did investigate a bit, they're not in a great hurry. This can't be developed, I think, and it's the same with many antibiotics. There's not a great business case to develop it. It has to be done by public approach. It's a public good. We can't rely on the free market to prioritize it, so we have to speak up and say, let's prioritize developing solutions that are actually widely available and benefit everybody. And if we discover that they're not working for some subset of the population, that's a red flag, and we need to investigate it as quickly as possible. I don't want to live in a world in which there's these stark divisions. I think it'll be very bad psychically, and it's also very bad from a practical point of view. The more inequality there is in society, the more likely there is to be pitchforks and revolutions and blood flowing all over. It's far better for everybody, including the 1%, if we are in a society in which there aren't such large discrepancies.
Thank you very much. I have a number of points, but come back to me if you run out of questions, David.
Okay, then, thanks very much. Okay, we'll go to Paul Laurie from Swanage next. Paul, I'm just unmuting you. Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
David, thank you for an excellent talk. I have a request and a question. The request is, could we have a copy of the slides? It would be good. I'd like to look over them again.
Sure.
My question is, as the future is quite uncertain and as these waves come and things change, how on earth did you come up with a probability of 50% that this will happen by 2060?
I think maybe we've lost David Wood for a moment, so we'll hopefully get him back again. David Wood, I don't know if you can hear us, but we've lost your audio for at the moment.
Sorry, I froze again, didn't I?
Okay.
I had the question. I had the question. What's the calculation behind the 50%? So it's in the last chapter of my book, in a sense. But basically, it's only very much a rough estimate. But I assess factors which are causing the progress to increase, and I find 5 such factors, and I also find 5 impediments, and there are 5 big impediments. And on the whole, I see them as roughly balanced. Now, all I can say is it's less than 100% and it's more than 10%. You know, it's very much a ballpark figure. But I want people to realize it is within some credibility, and it's worth going for. You know, if there's a possibility to win the jackpot, even if it's only a 20% possibility of winning the jackpot, you probably would invest. And so there's a huge jackpot of a sort available for at least those of us who want to continue living healthily and want our family members to continue living healthily, which is why to go for it. But I may revise my estimate in due course. I gave that estimate in 2016 when I wrote the book, and I stick with it because I am seeing interesting stuff happening in the meantime. I couldn't predict exactly what will happen, but some of the research from David Sinclair, whose book I highlighted there, the Harvard researcher, is very encouraging indeed. And some of the stuff in the SENS community, there are more startups there the whole time with more funding behind them. So progress is continuing roughly as I, in general terms, expected.
And could we have a copy of your slides, please? It'd be nice to look over them again.
I got that bit. I will email my slides to David and Lynn, and they will distribute them.
Yes, we'll do that. Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Okay, let's go to Sam Cousins next. Sam, I'll just unmute you.
You're still muted, Sam.
Yeah, I'll keep trying.
Hello.
Sam, can you? Yeah,
hear you now. Good.
Hear me now?
Go ahead.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so I've been interested in anti-aging ever since I found out my A-level biology teacher told me that she did a PhD in telomeres. But yeah, I suppose my question was more sort of on a political level, and it's there's a sort of a catch-22 because with companies, they obviously provide a lot of innovation, like private companies provide a lot of innovation, and that's the good point about capitalism. But the bad point is they only do that to make money. Whereas if there was a particularly benevolent government, they would obviously want to save money. So that's why they would, why companies like pharmaceutical companies especially would want to invest more in making cures for the diseases that you get via aging rather than actually curing aging itself. So they would lose out on a lot of money. But also the government doesn't think more than about 5 years ahead in a lot of things, and they get yearly budgets. So there's not a lot of hope there either. So what do you think is sort of the best solution to this catch-22?
So the solution is something called the mixed economy. Arguably the most important invention in the last 200 years was the mixed economy. Although we don't give it the praise it deserves, it allows the free markets to do what the free markets do best. It intervenes from time to time to address market failures. So the trust-busting work of Teddy Roosevelt, the Sherman Antitrust Act, breaking up some of the giant companies, that's one of the market failures, monopolies. So we need to let the free market do what it does best, but bear in mind that markets can fail. We need to get politicians looking ahead, but bear in mind that there are political failures too. And the right way is to get the two of them supporting in each other. There's the hand, but there's the thumb. So how do we get politicians to take a longer term view? Politicians do listen to people on the whole. If enough people say Black Lives Matter, politicians start saying, Black Lives Matter. One interesting thing about the COVID crisis is that some politicians sort of implied at the beginning, so what if some old people die? These old people are going to die soon enough. And the public reaction was very much against that. The public, by and large, said, given a choice between quite a lot of old people dying and the economy slowing down, we're prepared to have the economy slowing down. We don't want so many old people dying, thank you. At least that's been the view so far. And so politicians are now thinking, the ones who are sensitive to public opinion, maybe actually it's true, it's time to move away from worshipping the GDP in the way that it has been worshipped and have a wider index that looks at human well-being. A bit like Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister in New Zealand, has done. So we can learn from that. So the short answer is the mixed economy is the right answer. It's hard to manage the mixed economy, but let's find out why the mixed economy works and do more about it.
Yeah, because just to add to that point, I completely agree with you on the mixed economy, because obviously socialized aspects do the best at what they do, capitalized aspects, they provide us with all the gadgets, things that we do. So I think that people's needs should be socialized, people's wants should be privatized. And there was another point I was going to put on that. I've forgotten what it was now.
You can come back, Sam, if you want to.
It's on the top of my mind. It's so annoying.
Do you want David to just respond to the other points you've made? David, did you want to respond to anything else there that Sam brought up?
I think I responded to quite a few, but like Sam, I've forgotten what the other points were as well.
Okay.
Oh, I remember it now. Yeah, so going on from my point about politicians not thinking many years ahead, I think that's because both the left and the right wings are reactive rather than proactive in their policy making, so they don't think ahead for things like the NHS. They just want to do what's cheapest that year rather than what's cheapest long term. And obviously anti-aging treatment would be incredibly cheap long term.
I think there are better political models elsewhere in the world. So Germany, they have a very successful Green Party, which isn't in the national government, but it has a representation in many of the regional governments. They have the benefits of proportional representation, which means it's easier for minority parties to be included. And so they help to ensure longer term thinking. So there are some politicians around the world who do take longer term thoughts, and we need to encourage them to do that. In Britain, the people who tend to think longer term, strangely, are some of the older ones in the House of Lords. So some of the people who said the most interesting stuff about this are people like William Hague or Des Brown, the former defense minister. As they move away from the rough and tumble of everyday politics, they're able to use some of their political experience, but also their broader thinking. And so the all-party parliamentary group on aging that I mentioned, it tends to have the most interesting contributions from the Lords rather than the Commons, which is one reason why I'm not too much in a hurry to abolish the House of Lords. I think we need that longer term perspective too.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sam. Let's go to Neil Grant next. Neil, I'm just unmuting you. Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
Okay, thanks. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. David, thank you very much. Really, really interesting talk. Enjoyed it very much. My question is maybe dumbing things down a little bit. I quite like the idea of living longer. You know, like you, there are plenty of things that I've got on my agenda, my to-do list. But if I don't really fancy waiting until 2030 or 40 or 50 for, you know, science to catch up, what can I do right now, right here, right now, to maximize my chances? I'm thinking about, you know, food I eat. I was reading a book the other day that tells me that eating walnuts is a good plan, for example, or, you know, certain supplements or whatever. So assuming that I'm keeping as healthy and leading as clean a lifestyle as possible, what else would you suggest?
So walnuts are good. I think macadamias are better, as it happens. I'm showing this set of books again. The second and the third are packed with good advice. So that's the one by James Clement, Activate Your Metabolism for a Healthier Life. The benefits of intermittent fasting, basically, which means that we put our bodies into periods of time in which we eat much less. So that's what I personally practice. I do not 5-2, I do 2-5. So 2 days a week I eat quotes normally. 5 days a week I restrict myself to just about 600 calories, which I do by having pre-prepared meals. And it suits me fine. I don't feel hungry, and I just look forward to the days when I'm eating more. So there's many ways of doing intermittent fasting. The book by James Clement there, The Switch, covers that. The book by Chris Verburg, he's a young Belgian doctor. He covers some of the same ground and also has more of a future view too. So look at the Amazon reviews for both of these books. They're a good starting point. But I agree, the vision is let's live healthy in the short term in order to be able to live healthier and longer in the longer term too. Let's stay alive until the treatments are available that can help us stay alive even longer.
That's fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to be getting onto Amazon.
Okay, Neil.
Thank you.
Let's go to Chris Smith next. Chris, I'll just unmute you. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, hi. Yeah, apologies for the late arrival. My internet went down. I noticed that menopause was listed as a disease. I don't want to, you know, have that conversation now because it isn't particularly important. My point is, if this anti-aging prevented the menopause and women were fertile for many, many, many years longer, I'm not convinced that would be a good thing, because once I'd had 2 children, I'd had enough.
This is indeed a big topic. I often thought I should take menopause off that particular slide, but it's from Philippe Sierra, the person who came up with that particular formulation, so I've kept it on. But the question is looming. We might be able in due course to allow men and women to have children at much older ages. The same technologies that can undo aging might allow children not only to be conceived outside the womb, but grown outside the womb. This is so-called ectopic pregnancies. And generally people frown at this because those of us who read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley think, well, this is very dystopian. But some people might want to do it. And if they want to do it, I'm not sure we should necessarily stand against it. So some of the most fractious discussions at London Futurists sometimes revolve around this subject of artificial wombs. And some people say this is the height of hubris. It's the most terrible thing ever. And usually 1 or 2 people, usually women, say, you don't get it, do you? These women, for personal reasons, would very much like to be able to have children without them growing inside their womb. So we have to think about the possibility now, and it's a shocking possibility, but what we futurists try and do is help people to get around future shock and consider Might there be circumstances in which we could have more children later on? And it makes things more complicated because it might boost the population growth again. People have sometimes said that the population, the average size of a family has been shrinking and shrinking, which is true, but I'm not sure that trend will continue forever. So I'm not sure I should have answered your question because this opens up so many cans of worms, but actually no, it is an important thing to be discussed on this side of the questions of anti-aging. And there are other things, you know, till death do us part. We might be prepared to love our better halves for 70 years. If it's 700 years, do we have to rethink that? I'm in no hurry to rupture my own relationship with my own better half. We've been married nearly 40 years. I'm looking forward to another 40 years or more. But you know, the possibilities are there, and we need to think through. And we might decide we want to disallow it, but we need to hear from the people who don't want to disallow it.
Thank you.
Okay, and Chris. Yeah, on that point, David, it just occurred to me though that if you and your wife, if all of us with our partners, we're all gradually getting younger and younger, when we get to the point where we're back to sort of age 24 again, that could be okay, I think, for future relationship.
Some people are horrified at the idea, but I think it's just our instincts getting in the way. I mean, our instincts have been cultivated by the view that, hey, you've got to get used to getting old and dying. But thinking about it, it's going to be strange if we are as youthful as our children and as youthful as our grandchildren. But it's sort of, we're coming this way already. Sometimes you see pictures of mothers and daughters together, and you can sometimes it's hard to tell which is which. And if you look closely, you might tell the difference. And so it's sometimes called amortality. It's not immortality, but it's amortality. And we have to think it through. And again, I don't want to rule it out. And I think there could be many positive sides to it as well.
You may have covered this point, David, but I'm still a bit curious about the having children, how the human race can continue to have children if nobody dies. What was your point on that, or your thinking on that?
So a lot of the earth is currently not very well occupied by humans. We give vast portions of the earth over to growing cattle for growing meat. And we could restructure how much of the earth operates by growing meat in labs instead, or perhaps we might all decide to go vegan. That's another option. So if we can grow meat in labs without any slaughtering of any sentient beings, maybe some of the reasons to go vegan decline. So I think we can have many more people living on the planet than we have now, and it'll take a long time before the population doubles. I think it will take more than 100 years at the present rate. Even if nobody died anymore, it would still take about 100 years for the population to double. Is that right? Anyway, it's quite a while. And so I don't think there's a short-term issue, provided, it's a big if, provided we are sensible enough to restructure how we're using the land, and another very big if, provided we are able to get out of the risks of climate change, which are very big and will need close attention. In due course, we can build ecologically friendly skyscrapers, and even longer, we can move into the wider solar system, as science fiction has foreseen, if we want. And we could live in space stations orbiting the Earth. So in due course, again, who knows? And we would take the decision. But I don't want to tell everybody alive now, hey, you've got to accept that you will die within 30 or 40 or 50 years, just because in the longer term, we may have an issue that we haven't yet figured out how to solve. I think I would rather take that risk. I think there are plenty of possibilities for solving longer term overpopulation, and it's a higher priority to get rid of all the suffering and pain, loss of consciousness, loss of relationships, loss of ability that aging brings to us in today's world.
Thank you. Okay, I think we'll have our last two questions now, because we're running out of time. Roger and Sally, I'll take those as the last questions. So we'll go to you, Roger, and I'll just unmute you if I can. Yes, Roger, go ahead with your question.
Almost answered the question that I was going to ask in relation to the comment from David Warden. but you didn't answer it in the context that I was hoping you would, and that is the space for wildlife. We're already causing great problems by reducing habitats for wildlife and fragmenting those habitats that we do have. How do you respond to that?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a fan of what George Monbiot describes as the rewilding project. We have restricted more and more areas of the planet from wild animals. When humans were a young species, we were very small in number. Most of the wild animals had more population than humans. But as we have grown to dominate the earth, we have shrunk and shrunk and shrunk the populations of these wild animals. We should give at least some of the planet back to them. Absolutely. We can look also at resurrecting dinosaurs, perhaps. We can look at resurrecting mammoths. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Again, we should discuss it in advance, but it could be a fascinating thing to do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Okay, our last question will be from Sally then. So Sally, I'll just unmute you. Yes, Sally,
okay.
Go ahead.
My question was going to be exactly the same as Roger's, but I think I would like to take it a bit further and say, yes, the answer to Roger's question sounded absolutely admirable. I don't see really how you're going to reconcile that with having twice the number of humans on this planet that we have now. It seems to me that, you know, it's all very well being optimistic, but something's got to give, and certainly in the short term, and it needs to be in the short term from the animal point of view, because, you know, species are going extinct all the time now, and the numbers are dropping of all sorts of animals. You know, it's going to be a question of either or. Either we increase the human population or we increase the animal population. I don't think we're going to successfully do both at once. I mean, long term, maybe we can start having children again, but I mean, if we are going to all live for a very much longer time, I think we may need quite a long period when we're not having children.
So I don't want to be glib about this. I think there are real hard problems to be discussed, and the start is to discuss them as we're doing now. The general answer is that currently 50% of the Earth's population lives on 1% of the Earth's landmass. 99% is given over in part to animals, and in part of it's inhospitable because we haven't managed it. There are deserts of various sorts. We probably could recover quite a lot of land by intelligently remanaging the climate in these parts of the world, and we could figure out how to have more islands. We can reclaim some land from the sea if there's no risk of the sea growing. So there are possibilities to explore. We're not going to get to double the population overnight. It's going to take many decades, and in that decades, I agree, it is urgent. The most urgent thing is to head off the risk of accelerated global climate change. We talked about positive feedback cycles. The mainstream projections from the climate studies are frightening, but the extreme predictions are very frightening, and they might happen if there are positive feedback cycles with long buried methanes from the Siberian tundra and from the ocean depths being released, and we might see pretty rapid, when I say pretty rapid, maybe 10 degrees change in the average temperature within a decade. That seems to have happened historically, and it might happen again. And so as a real priority, we have to focus on that, which is one of the reasons why, after writing this, The Abolition of Aging, with all the stuff, the last few chapters I found the most challenging. So then I then went on to write about the political angles, including a big chapter about climate change, a big chapter about many of the other issues of inequality, how the market should work, chapters about growing more food in a healthy way. And I do think the most important technologies to get right are technologies for better politics and technologies for better education, so that more people more quickly can come to understand the issues that really matter and can master the skills that will help us to keep a calm mind, have emotional resilience, powerful human thoughtfulness and creativity to help us get the best of each other's knowledge and help us to go through this.
All right, Sally.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Okay, well, David, you've given us a fantastic afternoon of hugely stimulating thought and lots of extra reading that we can do. Thank you very much. If people would like to use the reactions button to appreciate David. Okay, so there's quite a lot of clapping going on, David. We hope very much that your transhumanist party will do well in the next election.
That's another long story. Let's not go down that route now.
Okay, okay.
With the proportional representation, I don't think we've any chance for the time being.
No, okay. Interesting.
Without
interesting
proportional
project.
representation, sadly.
Yeah. Well, thank you, David. I'm going to, I'll keep the meeting running for a little while if people want to hang around and chat for a while, but otherwise you're free to go. And we hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you very much. Thank you, David, again.